and this is Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop Presents A Conversation with Charles Fergus. Charles Fergus is the author of 20 books, including works about the wildlife of the mid-Atlantic states in the Northeast, guides to mushrooms, bears, turtles, and gun dog breeds, nature essays, a memoir, and 2 books in the Gideon Stoltz Mystery series. The first one is A Stranger Here Below, and the new one, which was just published, is called Nighthawk's Wing. He is book review editor for Shooting Sportsman magazine, and he has also written for publications as varied as Pennsylvania Game News, Audubon, Country Journal, Gray's Sporting Journal, Yale Review, and the New York Times. Fergus lives on a farm in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom with his wife, Nancy Marie Brown, who also writes books about Viking history and culture, and he can be reached at www.charlesfergus.com. Charles, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here, Bill.
Thank you. How did you get started with environmental writing? It seems like you've made a career of this.
Well, I've always been interested in nature, and I went through Penn State, where I got a writing degree with an area of specialization in science. And so I took a lot of courses, everything from meteorology and geology to ornithology. And just because of I would say just because of my lifetime love of nature and the outdoors, I naturally gravitated to writing about those subjects. My first job out of college was as a staff writer for Pennsylvania Game News magazine. And then I worked for a time for Penn State University. They have a research magazine, and struck out as a freelance. And when I did so, I began writing books about wildlife, hunting, nature, the outdoors, and just more or less continued on that path that I enjoyed taking.
So when you went through and you were writing these varied books, were you relying on your experiences? Was there classroom work, on-the-job training, research of, like mushroom books, mushrooms and game dog breeds, gun dog breeds? Where did all that come from?
Your list, all of the above. I do research in books. I spend time in the field. As it happens, the book about mushrooms is essentially co-authored with my father. He was a professor of mycology, or the study of mushrooms, at Penn State. And I grew up in State College. And often went with him collecting mushrooms. But the other subjects, hunting, I was a hunter, an avid hunter for quite a long time in my life, and observed wildlife and observed trees and read about trees, and found that I could actually write books about these subjects as well.
Mm-hmm. Was your father a hunter?
He was not. It's kind of interesting. I began to be a hunter myself, and had some mentors, but and neither of my parents probably understood it much, but they didn't stand in the way either.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was noticing as I was reading your books how much nature shows up. There's a sensitivity to it as well. And if you don't mind, I can read a small passage from Nighthawk's Wing, just one of these little things. And I say this, it's not a little thing, actually. I understand from trying to write books myself, how much detail you have to put in to carry the story. And for setting your books in the 1830s in Pennsylvania, there is an enormous amount of detail that shows up all from the natural world. And this is about your sheriff, Gideon. And it's just a simple passage of description here. As they approached the house, Gideon halted. Between the door and the window, a length of tree branch had been nailed to the wall. Attached to the branch was a gray, papery hornet's nest 1.5 feet long. Black and white hornets went in and out of a hole in the bottom of the egg-shaped nest. Some of the hornets went winging off into the yard. Others flew in through the open window. "Isn't it dangerous to have those insects inside your house?" Gideon asked. Knopf chuckled. "If you don't bother them, they won't sting you. I found that nest in the woods and brought it here. The hornets do me the favor of catching flies, which they take back to their nest and eat." Gideon wondered how one could relocate a big nest full of angry, stinging insects, but he didn't ask. His business there was more serious. I find that fascinating, how they would relocate a nest, because we have hornets outside our house, and the last thing we would ever want is to have them in our house. And yet this is perfectly natural for them.
This was what people did in the 19th century, in an era before window screens. There were no window screens on houses at that time. So yeah, it's a detail from the natural world, natural history, that I wanted to add, just to create a strong sense of place, a strong sense of time, a verisimilitude. And I find that these sorts of details, or details about technology, let's say, or about social customs or foods, whatever it may be, these are the kinds of things that really draw a reader into a story. They make a story come alive for the reader. And as a writer, what you need to do is you need to know that all of these facts that you use should be in service of your story, because the story is what keeps the reader turning pages. The story pulls the reader through the book and the narrative. But these other facts, I think, make it a richer experience for the reader, and involve them in the fictional dream. They read this, the story, and they become absorbed by it. And that's what I really am trying to do as a novelist, is to paint a very detailed picture that calls upon readers' senses and reveals interesting things about a time period that really kind of augments the story and keeps them wanting to turn pages, in addition to the plot as it is developing and being carried out within the novel.
That's what impressed me about the two books, is that I could literally, and I actually did this just before settling down, once I realized this, is that I could open to any page in the book and come upon a description of nature or character. And I understand how much work is involved in that. That's so very, very well done. The other thing about your historicals, they're set in 1835 Pennsylvania, is that correct?
1830s. Yeah, the first one is 1835. The second one is 1836. I'm working right now and actually approaching having a completed draft of the third in the series, which takes place in 1837.
And this is in a mythical county in, what was it, central Pennsylvania, or was it over near Pittsburgh? I can't remember.
Central Pennsylvania. Yeah, it's a fictional county. It's called Coleraine County. And the town is fictional as well. It's called Adamant. The town is the county seat for Coleraine County, and it's where Gideon Stoltz, a young man to have the job of sheriff. He's in his early 20s when the series starts. It's where he works, and where he has been appointed as sheriff because the man who hired him as a deputy died unexpectedly from a stroke. And so the Cheapskate County commissioners decided that they could hire Gideon to finish out the original sheriff's term. And lo and behold, in book number 2, he is elected. No, excuse me, I guess it's after book number 2. It's in book number 3. He actually gets elected for a 3-year term as sheriff of Coleraine County.
I didn't want to ask about that, since obviously it didn't occur. And of course, part of that is there's a resentment among many of the people because, okay, I cannot get this straight. He's Deutsch. How would you identify him? Okay, well, obviously it makes a big difference in the book.
Gideon is Pennsylvanisch Deutsch.
Thank you.
He's Pennsylvania German. Pennsylvanisch Deutsch would be Pennsylvanian German or Dutch. And Deutsch is corrupted to Dutch by most people, including most Pennsylvania Germans today. So Bill Peschel, I'm going to guess that name is Pennsylvania Dutch.
It is actually from the Bavarian area. So southern Germany, but it's definitely German, yes. And right. my wife's maiden name is Baltrush. And in fact, her mother comes from roughly the same area as well. She is native. They met a few years after the war. So yes, I have very strong German ties in my background.
Well, and many people in Pennsylvania do. And I worked with, dozens, if not hundreds of people of German background. One in my jobs at Pennsylvania Game Commission in Penn State, My college roommate at Penn State was Earl Schreckengast, pretty good German name. And it's interesting because nowadays, Pennsylvania Germans it's kind of an interesting aspect of a person's character, right? Mm-hmm. You have Pennsylvania, you have German descent. But in the 1830s, it wasn't exactly that way. And most Pennsylvania Germans lived in and settled in the southeastern part of the state, good farmland down there. But a number of them also moved farther west, including into Center County, which is the county on which Coleraine County is modeled. And when they did that, they often came up against settlers who had been there before them. And that would be the Scotch-Irish in many cases, English, Scotch-Irish, people from northern England usually, or lowland Scotland. And there was a little bit of friction. There was a little bit of resentment on the part of the Scotch-Irish, I would say. And they are a notoriously clannish group of people. And Fergus is a Scottish name. And my ancestors came into Pennsylvania from lowland Scotland in the mid-1700s. And they were part of this wave of people from northern Britain who basically got pushed past the settled areas because that land was already taken. And they, in essence, became sort of the shock troops of the settlement of the United States. And they were the ones who were often the ones who were fighting with the Native Americans. And they left their imprint on the land. They left their names on the land. And many of them are still there. And today in central Pennsylvania, where I grew up, there was really no distinction made between people with German names or people with Scotch-Irish names or people with French names or whatever. But in the 1830s, there was some strife. And, to be honest, what really propels a novel is tension. And so I wanted my main character to be different, to be othered, to be a cause of tension in a way, and he perceives the way people feel about him and sometimes react to him and some of the things they say to him. It turns out he's married to a young woman of Scotch-Irish descent. True Burns was her name before she married him, and she's now True Stoltz. So I wanted this tension to be revealed in the pages of the story. And in doing research, I found examples of the kinds of strife that existed. Like I remember reading a description of a farmer whose last name was Moore, Moore, which is a good Scotch-Irish name. And he was having a boundary dispute with a Pennsylvania German who had bought his neighbor's farm. And when he was on his deathbed, he said, "I want you to bury me right on the line so the damn Dutch don't come over it."
It's an interesting coincidence. My mother was Evelyn May Moore, and she's descendants of William and Mary Moore, who came over in 1777. They settled in Virginia and then moved to Northeast Ohio because they didn't like the slavery. So I find that I wonder if he's a familial connection.
Could be.
It's what's interesting, and that is there's very True also has second sight, if I understand correct, if I name it correctly. Is that kind of phenomenon or that kind of superstition common at the time?
It's very interesting how one of the things that I found out when I, in my reading of accounts, of various sorts of accounts, travelers' tales, historical books of history, whatever, is the fact that so many people strongly believed in the supernatural. They believed in ghosts. They believed in many cases, witchcraft. So that was kind of revealing to me. But yes, True has the ability, which is not necessarily something that she wants to have, to sometimes be visited by these visions of things that are happening at a remove. And she gets this really from her grandmother, whom she calls Graham Burns. And Graham is often what the Scotch Irish would call their grandmother. And the grandfather would be Pap, Graham and Pap. Anyway, Graham Burns has a second sight as well. And Graham Burns has seen things that were revealed in the first novel, but then True has discovered that she has this strange ability as well. And one of the key points in Nighthawk's Wing is when she is visited by a vision of her husband lying bound somewhere in the darkness. She realizes it's probably a cave, and she is then she has to make the decision to try to go there and to help him.
There's some conflict between her and her husband as well, who kind of doesn't necessarily want to believe in that. That shows up in the first book.
Gideon considers himself to be a rational man, a man for whom ratiocination and thought and logical processes of deduction are important. Mm-hmm. And so when he listens to his wife talking about this dream she had, and she saw yellow teeth, and then it means that she saw white teeth they were bloody, and it means that someone young is going to die. If there had been yellow teeth, someone old was going to die. And so he poo-poos this, and though that is a folk belief out of the Scotch-Irish culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is also another element that shows up in your books, and that is the murder of Gideon's mother, which I would not bring up, except you do on your website, and you actually link to the article you wrote for the Yale Review, which is enormously very affecting and very sad. What compelled you to write about your mother's murder and that you discovered the body? Why do you feel compelled to include this as part of Gideon's story?
Well, it's interesting because when I wrote a draft of this novel where Gideon did not have that in his background, and a friend of mine who is a very good reader read the book, and she said, "This is good, but you know what? You could really make this more powerful by having Gideon having him lost. I'm not saying this grammatically. Creating a character who has lost a family member to murder, and that will allow you to write more forcefully and dramatically and emotionally about the human phenomenon of murder." And yes, indeed, my mother was murdered in 1995, and I found her body, and it was a hugely affecting thing. And when I read a murder mystery that does not honor the weight, the monumental weight of the human phenomenon of murder, I must say that I don't really don't have as much respect for the author. I wanted to write a book that was honest. I wanted to write a book that was compelling, and I wanted to write a book that treated murder for the horrific, life-changing, life-swerving event, even for the survivors, that it is. The murder has effects on, obviously on the victim, but also on the victim's family and friends and community, and even the people who are tasked with investigating the murders as members of the law enforcement community. So I wanted to write realistically about murder. I don't want it to be a gimmick in my stories. And therefore, I called upon my own memories of what happened back in 1995 and for the next few years afterward. And I brought that into my character of Gideon Stoltz.
Well, it certainly makes for a very powerful narrative. And if people will want to know more, they can visit your website at charlesfergus.com. Under the About Me section, there's a link to the Yale Review article that Charles wrote about it. The interesting thing I found about the first book is that it's one of the few about a stranger here below, is that it was sort of a why done it, as opposed to a who done it, because it involves the suicide of Gideon's friend and fellow hunter, a judge. how did you come up with the basic idea for that story?
Yeah, when you say why done it, Bill, that's exactly correct, because I think that almost everyone who reads that novel will settle upon the local iron master, Adonijah Thompson, as probably somebody who has done some underhanded and evil things that have led to the suicide of Hiram Biddle, Gideon's mentor and friend, the judge of Coleraine County. The way that I settled upon this plot device is that I read a very small book called On the Danish Peninsula, and it had in it a tale called The Parson at Vileby. And this was written back in the 1600s. And it had to do, it was written in the 1800s to describe an event that took place in Denmark in the 1600s. And it had to do with a wealthy farmer tricking a local judge who was his rival for the hand of a young woman into believing that the young woman's father had committed murder. And the young woman's father had rejected the wealthy farmer as a suitor for his daughter. And so the wealthy farmer was out to exact vengeance upon pretty much everybody, and he did so. So I read this book and I thought to myself, could this be an interior plot element? And what would happen if you had a young sheriff? Oh, and the other thing that I should add is that in The Parson at Vileby, the judge who has to sentence his betrothed's father to death for having committed murder, although in fact it was a trick, and the man did not commit murder. It involved sleepwalking, and it's a pretty fascinating story. Anyway, where was I going with this?
Source of that was the source of you. So basically you found a great story and kind of lifted it and put it to your own use
and extended it, because because then the question becomes, okay, this horrible malfeasance took place. This young sheriff is confronted by the situation where there's a suicide, and he wonders why his friend and mentor killed himself. And as he digs more deeply into this, he finds out these things about the town's past and about the probable nefarious doings of this iron master, who I've used instead of a wealthy farmer. And so I just kind of extended the plot to and set it in a completely different place and era, and it was a nice framework to be able to write around.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. It works very, very effectively. How did you segue into fiction writing from all your nonfiction writing? Where did you pick up the skills? Because actually, the more I'm listening to this, the more fascinated I am, because this is not a one and done draft. This is really very well written, and I'm surprised to see it come out. It's like you're coming out of the woodwork. Like, here you are, already fully formed. What happened before your book here?
Well, I actually did write a novel previously that was published to good reviews, and this was back in the early 1990s, 1991, I think it came out. It was called Shadow Catcher, and it was a historical novel about the Rodman Wanamaker expedition of citizenship to the North American Indian, which really took place in 1913. And the novel combined that historical event, in which a private rail car went around the country to something like 30 Indian reservations, and they were taking these photographs of Indians as well, and then the Indians were thought to be a vanishing race. So what I did was I added a young man to this expedition who was taking candid photographs. And this was at the dawn of candid photography. He has a concealed camera that he wears under his shirt. And he makes, and instead of a button, he's got a camera lens. But anyway, he makes photographs that contradict the romantic images that are coming back from this expedition. anyway, I wrote that novel, and I probably would have gone on and continued to write novels. It was published by Soho Press, which is a very good independent house, and it became a Book of the Month Club selection. So it did well. It was optioned for a film. Unfortunately, the film was never made. But then I began writing. But before my agent was able to place the novel, I needed to make a living. So I proposed a book about the Florida panther, the endangered cougar that lives in Florida. And that was accepted by Ferris, Strauss and Giroux, another very good publishing house. And they gave me money up front to do it. And that was part of why I didn't continue simply writing the novels, because I needed to make a living. And I could get an advance against royalties on a nonfiction book, whereas I had to, present a fully finished novel in order for a publisher to pay me money. But I've always loved to read fiction, and that's what I tend to read, other than the material that I'm reading for research, let's say. So I love to read fiction, and I really have always wanted to write it, always loved writing it, ever since I took courses in writing fiction at Penn State back in the 1970s when I was a student there. And now I'm at a point in my life where I don't need to get an advance against royalties necessarily to keep writing a book or keep writing books. And I really like the character of Gideon Stoltz. I really like his wife, True, and she is emerging as a major independent character in her own right in the second book, and that continues even more so in the third book, which is, like I said earlier, I almost have a draft done of it. But anyway, I'm really glad that you consider these books to be well written, and I do put a lot of work and effort into them. I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, and I just have a heck of a good time writing these mysteries, and I hope to be able to continue for several more.
I'm reminded of a comment Terry Pratchett once made when he's talking about his internal monologue as he's writing. He says, when he's getting near the end of the book, and he says, and if you're a good boy, you get to write another book. That's somebody who obviously obviously enjoys the process.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. What are your favorite mystery writers? Or is there a book recently that you've read that you said, wow, I'd really like to say something nice about this? Yeah,
absolutely. I actually have a list of that, because people ask me that and then my mind goes blank. So I'm going to I just pulled a list in front of me. Glendon Swarthout. He's not a mystery writer, but I love his historical novels. So that's the historical side. In terms of mysteries, Arnaldur Indriðason. He's an Icelandic mystery writer, and his Inspector Erlander novels are terrific. They are modern day. Michael Connelly's Harry Bosch mysteries are among my favorites. And it's kind of odd, because I wouldn't necessarily think that I'd be attracted to mysteries set in present day Los Angeles, or at least early 2000s Los Angeles, but I am. I just love the character Harry Bosch. He's a wonderful main character with his own, griefs and travails and difficulties, and so he's a very interesting human being. Walter Mosley's LA novels I like a great deal. I like Peter Robinson's D.S.I. Alan Banks novels, which are set in London. The Bernie Gunther series by Philip Kerr, set in pre-World War II Berlin. Fantastic books. Really quite wonderful. Ian Rankin's Inspector Rebus mysteries. And I like some lighter mysteries as well, like the Ladies' Number One Detective Agency series by Alexander McCall Smith. So those are a few. James Lee Burke is another writer that I like a great deal. And you could call his books kind of a combination between a mystery and a thriller. But he writes wonderfully about the natural setting and the weathers that surround the events in his stories, and whether they're set in the Louisiana Bayou, which is where he sets a lot of his stories, or in Texas and Montana. He has 3 series, and then that's where they're set. So James Lee Burke is another terrific mystery writer.
You've mentioned several of my favorites as well, including Peter Robinson and Ian Rankin, especially from back in the day. When I was reviewing books in the 80s and 90s, and I was getting a lot of mysteries, and they always rose to the top of the to be read and reviewed list. Wanted to talk about something else as well. You have a different book that I have a personal kind of connection to. It's Make a Home for Wildlife. And I say that because what surprised me about doing something like that is that we did this in Hershey. We live on a very small plot in basically suburban Hershey. When we moved in 20 years ago, it was flat. There were no trees. I think there was a hedge along one side, and we started planting, and we managed to create a wildlife refuge. We actually got it certified by the National Wildlife Federation. And we have, from basically nothing, we've had, opossums, snakes, groundhogs, chipmunks. We've actually seen raccoons. And we're in an area that is suburban, that we're really surrounded, except for the railroad tracks about a block down the road. There's not really that much of transit among these creatures. And yet, by basically allowing half the yard to kind of grow on its own with some help from plantings of us, I'm amazed at just the difference that it made, both in the local environment being cooler and much easier to live with, but the amount of wildlife recovery that came about from over this period of time by partially just kind of leaving a lot of it alone.
Well, it's interesting that the concept that if everybody did that, or if at least a lot more people did that in suburbs and in towns, even in cities, you would essentially create a huge wildlife refuge across the country, right?
Yeah.
Small pieces, but they all add up. And, the more we can do to help songbirds, the more we can do to help mammals, the better. And I live in, my wife and I live on 120 acres here in northern Vermont. So we see wildlife a lot. But there are still things that I do on our property that I wrote about in this book, Make a Home for Wildlife. Things like daylighting apple trees and planting native shrubs that provide food for wildlife. And so we hear and see a lot of wildlife. And the other night, I was lying in bed, I was asleep, and I was woken up out of a deep sleep by this really strange, frankly, horrifying, sort of a hollow, howling type growl, and it was right outside the window. And I have to admit that I didn't know what it was, but I do know that it really flooded my system with adrenaline and got my heart beating way too fast. And so I thought to myself, well, what do you think it could be? And the next morning I got online and I searched on fox barking, because we had foxes that raised a litter of puppies on a little hillock right behind our barn this spring. And I'm thinking, I bet it's the foxes. And indeed, that's what it was. It's a really eerie sound. And if I've heard it, I don't remember hearing it before. So then what I did was I went and I thought, I've got just the place in the current Gideon Stoltz mystery where I can insert this eerie sound, and so I put it into the story. So it made its way very, very quickly into my fiction.
I could see that would lead to some superstitious suggestibility on the part of maybe the characters, that it's a warning sign or a cry for help. And my daughter, who frequents YouTube, had talked about that. Apparently, she came across what foxes sound like, and they have cries like babies or infants as well. It's something it's kind of weird that we have, as the Gideon Stoltz would experience nature directly. It seems like we experience nature indirectly through the use of other people's videos. It's just another difference between how they lived back in 1830s Pennsylvania, how they're close to the land, close to nature. They have to be. And how distant we can be to the point where there would be people who can't believe that food comes out of the ground. How divorced we can be from reality.
Well, and one of the challenges for me as a writer of historical fiction set in a specific region at a specific time, 1830s, is what was that landscape like at that time? And one resource that I found that's been, and I actually I have an email newsletter, and I'd like to invite anyone who's listening, who listens to this interview conversation, to subscribe to this newsletter. But I wrote an installment of it about this map that I found. It turns out that in 1820, the Pennsylvania legislature commissioned a man from Scotland, his name was John Mellish, to create a detailed map of every county in the Commonwealth. And so he hired a lot of surveyors and a lot of map makers, and they all went out into these various different counties and they created maps. And so the one for Center County, which is the model for Coleraine County, where Gideon Stoltz is sheriff, it has incredible detail on it, showing really in many ways what the amount of human settlement and the roads were like during that era. And there are symbols on the maps for mills, for churches, for taverns, for sinkholes, and just tremendous diversity of descriptive symbols. And then there's also a written legend that talks about what percentage of the county land is tillable, and of that, what percentage has been cleared. And as it turns out, only about 10% of the county had been cleared at that time, telling me that, in 1836, about 15 years later, not a whole lot more would have been. You would have had a lot of primeval forest. And fortunately, there are pockets of old growth, original forest left, scattered throughout Pennsylvania. And most of them are preserved as state forest natural areas. And one of these is Allen Seeger Natural Area in Huntingdon County, which is just over Tussey Mountain from the Nittany Valley, where I grew up in Center County. And it's an amazing place. My father, the mycologist, used to take me there because it's a beautiful old intact forest, and he would find many, many specimens of mushrooms there to place into the university's mushroom herbarium as samples. And so I have very vivid memories from my childhood of being among these immense hemlocks and white pines and white oaks and tulip poplars in this, almost cathedral-like forest with dense undergrowth of rhododendron in places and a stream. And so there are places where we can go and kind of get a feel for what the woods was like, when Gideon Stoltz was riding on his horse through these areas on very poor roads, trying to solve crimes. This is way before closed circuit TV, way before fingerprints.
That's right. Way before CSI.
Way before telephones. And way before cars.
And railroads too, because that makes a big difference. This is why you have so many local, every small town had their local miller, their local ironworks, whatever local resources could be exploited.
Gunsmith, whatever. Yeah. The railroad had not reached central Pennsylvania by the 1830s.
Yeah.
It was the canal was the big form of transportation, and canals didn't go everywhere either. Mm-hmm. So it was a different world. Yeah.
Well, one wonders what the history of Harrisburg area would have been like if the Susquehanna had been navigable. And it's not. So it would have actually been a port town rather than just, the capital city. It would have been something very, very different. Well, Charles, I want to thank you very, very much for talking with us today. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I certainly recommend that people check out his two books, his Gideon Stoltz books, A Stranger Here Below and Nighthawk's Wing. And if you want to learn more, his website is available at www.charlesfergus.com. And as he mentions, he has a newsletter, so consider signing up, won't you? Charles, thank you very, very much for talking with us today.
It's been a complete pleasure, Bill.
Absolutely. This is Bill Peschel, and this is Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents, a conversation with Charles Fergus, and I hope your favorite book is your next one. Thank you for showing up.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
a lot.
The Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents podcast is sponsored by the Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. The store is open with limited hours, plus we accept appointments and offer a drive-by service. The store will also ship books to your home, including those from the Peschel Press Mystery line, including our annotated editions of novels by Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. To learn more, visit the store at www.mysterybooksonline.com. And thank you for listening.